what I discovered is that countries that are oppressors, that continue to be colonial occupiers.
Beneath the polished press releases and diplomatic smiles lies a raw truth about power. It's not in the headlines or the aid packages. It's in the soil, in the seeds, in the quiet systems that dictate who eats and who kneels. For decades, the West, led by the United States, used food as a weapon to bind Africa to its will. But the ground has shifted. Africa has rejected $124 billion worth of U.S. soybeans. And this isn't just a trade dispute. It's a declaration of sovereignty. Let's dive into how Africa broke free, how America's heartland is crumbling under its own strategy, and what this means for the future of global power. The weaponization of food. To think the U.S. sent soybeans and grains to Africa purely out of charity is to miss how empires work. Every bushel, every aid package came with invisible strings. Food wasn't given, it was leveraged. In the 20th century, U.S. agricultural policy created massive crop surpluses through subsidies and mechanized farming. These surpluses needed a destination, and Africa, with its diverse climates and agricultural potential, became the perfect target. On the surface, it looked like generosity, American grain feeding hungry nations. In reality, it was a calculated move to erode self-sufficiency. U.S. exports flooded African markets at prices local farmers couldn't compete with. Families who once grew their own food abandoned their fields, unable to match the subsidized imports. As local supply chains weakened and traditional farming knowledge faded, the U.S. tightened its grip. Prices rose, conditions were imposed, and food became a tool of control, a silent weapon in Washington's arsenal. This wasn't accidental. American agribusiness, backed by powerful lobbies and government support, saw Africa as a captive market. Food aid doubled as a geopolitical strategy, securing influence through dependency. African leaders who resisted found shipments delayed or cut. Food became a bargaining chip, used to sway votes in international forums or secure military agreements. The result? Rural African economies stagnated, local pride in cultivation eroded, and farmers became consumers of imports. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was a chain around Africa's sovereignty, Africa's awakening. But the story doesn't end there. African leaders began to see through the facade. They recognized that true independence starts in the soil. A nation that can't feed itself can never be free. This realization sparked a philosophical and practical revolution. Governments invested heavily in agriculture. Irrigation projects tamed arid lands, research institutes developed local seed varieties, and fertilizer plants reduced reliance on imports. Processing facilities ensured that soybeans were crushed into oil and meal locally, keeping value on the continent. This wasn't just about money, it was about partnerships that respected Africa's agency. Brazil, a former victim of U.S. agricultural dominance, shared its expertise in tropical soybean farming. India provided drought-resistant seeds and trained a new generation of African agronomists. China financed infrastructure, dams, roads, and crushing plants, without the political ransom demanded by the West. These South-South alliances were built on mutual respect, not dependency. Farmers became central to this revolution. Cooperatives gave smallholders access to credit and machinery, while universities trained young agronomists. Mobile technology delivered real-time weather forecasts and market prices to rural farmers. By the time the U.S. noticed, Africa's silos were full, its fields thriving, and its markets humming. The $124 billion soybean blockade wasn't a rash decision. It was the culmination of decades of preparation. Africa didn't just reject U.S. soy, it declared it no longer needed it. The fallout in America's heartland. While Africa rose, America's heartland faced a reckoning. For generations, farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri were told their crops fed the world. Africa was sold as the eternal market for their surplus soy. But when Africa blocked those exports, the myth collapsed. Silos overflowed with unsold stock, prices plummeted, and loans turned toxic. Rural towns built around agriculture teetered on the edge of collapse. Tractor dealerships, grain elevators, and processing plants faced ruin. The damage wasn't just economic, it was psychological. Farmers who believed their labor was indispensable now faced a world that no longer needed them. This came on the heels of Trump's tariff wars with China, which had already slashed demand. Subsidies couldn't restore dignity. Bankruptcies surged, foreclosures echoed the 1980s farm crisis, and suicides among farmers climbed. Rural communities, once the backbone of America's political machine, now saw Washington as their betrayer. The empire that weaponized food against Africa was now devouring its own. The power of alliances. Africa's defiance wasn't a solo act. It was backed by a web of alliances. Brazil, India, and China, each with their own histories of resisting Western dominance, played distinct roles. Brazil shared its tropical farming expertise, turning Africa into a mirror of its own agricultural revolution. India provided adaptable seeds and educational programs, empowering African farmers to face climate challenges. China's infrastructure investments, roads, dams, and plants, unlocked Africa's potential without the strings attached by Western aid. These partnerships weren't about charity, they were about mutual gain. Brazil gained a trade partner, India built markets, and China secured influence through investment, not control. Together, they broke Washington's monopoly. Africa's alliances sent a clear message: the continent was no longer a pawn in Western games. By diversifying its partners, Africa turned vulnerability into bargaining power, ensuring no single nation could dictate its future. The broader implications: the soybean blockade is more than a trade dispute, it's a warning shot. If Africa can reject U.S. soy, what else can it reject? Food sovereignty is just the beginning. The same logic applies to energy, finance, and diplomacy. Western companies have long extracted Africa's oil, gas, and minerals, leaving little behind. Now, African nations are investing in refineries and renewable energy, refusing to export raw resources without adding value locally. Just as soy is processed on African soil, so too are minerals and fuels. Finance is following suit. The IMF and World Bank once tied aid to crippling austerity, but Africa is building alternatives. Regional banks, sovereign wealth funds, and digital currencies under the African Continental Free Trade Area are gaining traction. If Africa can feed itself without U.S. soy, why not finance itself without U.S. dollars? Politically, the continent is finding its voice. Free from the threat of food shortages, African states can negotiate on equal terms in global forums. The African Continental Free Trade Area is knitting together 55 economies into a single force. If Nigeria can supply Ghana and Kenya can trade with Tanzania without Western intermediaries, Africa becomes an empire of producers, not consumers. The soybean blockade proved the system works. Now it's being scaled to every sector. A new world order. Soybeans were never just about food, they were about power. For decades, America believed Africa couldn't survive without its crops. Today, Africa thrives while America's heartland crumbles. This isn't a blip in trade flows, it's a rupture in history. The chain of dependency Washington wrapped around Africa has snapped, and the recoil is breaking America's back. But the story doesn't end with soy. It's a blueprint for what's next. If Africa can block U.S. exports, it can block Western dominance in energy, finance, and beyond. The question isn't whether Africa can survive without the West. It's whether the West can survive a world where Africa is free. Food sovereignty was the first battlefield, but the war is for total independence. Every seed planted, every alliance forged, every chain broken brings Africa closer to owning its destiny. This is a thank you to communities like Black Culture Diary, where stories of resilience and legacy are amplified. By supporting these platforms, you're joining a movement to reclaim narratives and celebrate sovereignty. The soybean revolution is a symbol of what's possible when a continent refuses to bow. The future isn't in Washington's hands, it's in Africa's soil.